In the glass lobby of Sterling Dominion, bodyguard Jackson Reed ripped the phone from the hand of a quiet single father named Mason Carter and smashed it against the marble floor. Mason did not resist. He only looked at the shattered pieces and warned that the call could not be cut off. Jackson laughed, certain the stranger was faking importance to reach young Chief Executive Amelia Sterling. Seconds later, security radios erupted, elevators locked down, and the board fell into panic. Jackson turned pale when he suddenly realized the voice on that call had just ordered the entire corporation frozen. Stay with this story to the end to see how one destroyed phone call reversed everything and saved an empire. The morning was cold and gray over Chicago, rain sliding down the glass towers of the financial district, when Mason Carter stepped through the revolving doors of Sterling Dominion, wearing an old coat that had seen too many winters. He carried no assistant, no bodyguard, no car waiting at the curb. In his hand was a single secured phone and a sealed envelope with no name written on the front. He asked the receptionist for a meeting with Amelia Sterling before the 10 o'clock board session, speaking with the calm patience of a man who expected to be doubted. The receptionist searched the guest list twice and found nothing. Mason did not raise his voice. He simply told her the list had been altered at 6:17 that morning, edited by an account that no longer held active permissions. The precision of the detail confused her, and it caught the attention of the security desk nearby. Jackson Reed arrived within minutes, flanked by two of his men, his posture rigid with the discipline of a man who had spent years in uniform before this one. He had already received a warning from Connor Blake describing a disgruntled former employee who might try to extort the young chief executive. The file Connor forwarded included a photograph of Mason, but the description beneath it had been quietly rewritten to paint him as a credible threat of violence. Jackson ordered Mason to leave the building. Mason, still composed, suggested that Jackson simply call Grace Parker or Amelia directly to confirm his identity before making a decision he could not undo. Jackson refused, explaining that the entire executive floor was currently under a heightened security protocol and could not be disturbed. At that moment, the secured phone in Mason's hand began to ring. The screen displayed only a high-level authentication code, no name, no number that meant anything to the men watching. Mason answered and said quietly that he had arrived but was being stopped in the lobby. On the other end, a voice belonging to Joseph Sterling instructed him not to reveal his identity until they knew who was monitoring the communication systems inside the building. Mason understood immediately that Jackson was likely acting on false information rather than malice, and he kept his tone even, refusing to escalate a fight he did not need to win in that moment. He warned Jackson, without threat in his voice, that if the call were cut before verification was complete, an emergency protocol would activate on its own. Jackson interpreted the warning as manipulation, a desperate man inventing consequences to buy himself time and access. He had seen every version of that trick before, men who claimed connections they did not have, who used confidence as a weapon against people whose job was to say no. He reached for the phone in Mason's hand, certain he was doing exactly what his training demanded. Mason did not pull away. He looked directly at Jackson, his expression unreadable, and told him this was the last chance to verify the order before something irreversible happened. Behind them, employees crossing the lobby slowed their steps, sensing that something in the room had shifted, though none of them yet understood why a stranger in an old coat was standing so calmly at the center of it. The rain outside kept falling, and somewhere beyond the walls of Sterling Dominion, a dying founder waited on the line for an answer that would decide far more than one confrontation in a lobby. Jackson tore the phone from Mason's grip in one sharp motion. Mason could have resisted. His instincts were faster than most people in that lobby would ever guess, but he chose stillness instead, unwilling to turn a corporate atrium into a brawl broadcast on every camera in the building. Jackson demanded the caller identify himself immediately. On the other end, Joseph stayed silent, aware that the line might already be compromised by people inside his own company. In Jackson's earpiece, Connor's voice cut through, sharp and certain, insisting that the device likely carried malicious software and needed to be destroyed before it could do any damage. Jackson threw the phone to the stone floor and brought his heel down hard, again and again until the casing split apart and the screen went dark for good. The lobby fell silent, then filled with the quiet sound of employees lifting their own phones to record what had just happened. Mason crouched down without anger and retrieved a small encrypted chip from among the broken fragments. He asked Jackson calmly whether he understood who that device had been registered to. Jackson said he did not care and ordered his men to escort Mason out of the building. Less than 10 seconds later, the lighting throughout the lobby shifted to a deep warning red. Every reinforced glass door sealed itself automatically. The elevators stopped mid-shaft. Financial transactions across the entire corporation froze in place. The server floor switched into full isolation mode, and every internal screen displayed a single emergency administrative alert without explaining its cause to anyone watching. Jackson's radio crackled with a direct call from the National Security Verification Center responsible for auditing the Sentinel system, the very network Sterling Dominion had built its reputation on. The dispatcher asked him to confirm, immediately, the current status of a device registered under the personal authorization of Joseph Sterling. Jackson went still at the sound of the founder's name. He turned to Mason and asked, almost involuntarily, whether the voice on that call had truly belonged to Joseph himself. Mason did not answer right away. Instead, he asked Jackson why he had chosen to destroy the only evidence in the room before verifying anything at all. Connor's voice broke in over the radio, insisting this was nothing more than a voice spoofing trick designed to create panic. Mason pointed out, quietly, that Connor had just referenced the sound of a voice Jackson had never actually described hearing, a detail that should have been impossible for him to know. That small inconsistency planted the first seed of doubt in Jackson's mind about the man giving him orders. He had followed Connor without question for years, trusting the chain of command the way soldiers were trained to, and it had never once occurred to him to ask whether the man above him might be lying. Moments later, Amelia came down the emergency stairwell, furious that her entire board session had just been suspended without explanation and without her authorization. Ryan Walker walked beside her, already accusing Mason of launching an attack on the company's systems, his voice smooth with practiced concern, every word calibrated to sound like protection rather than sabotage. Mason looked past Ryan and met Amelia's eyes directly, unbothered by the accusation, as though he had expected it long before he ever walked through the front doors that morning. He told her, without raising his voice, that the father she believed was unconscious and far away had just tried to warn her that someone standing beside her right now was preparing to take the entire corporation for himself. Amelia's expression flickered between disbelief and something closer to fear, the kind that comes from realizing a stranger might know more about your own family than you do. Around them, the frozen lobby held its breath, red light washing over marble floors and stunned faces, while somewhere deep inside the building's server core, a silent alarm kept counting down toward a deadline none of them could yet see. Amelia's first instinct was suspicion, a belief that this stranger was exploiting her father's fragile health for some purpose she could not yet name. Ryan leaned into that suspicion immediately, urging her to let security detain Mason on charges of trespassing and system manipulation before the situation grew any worse. Mason did not argue about power or position. Instead, he asked Grace Parker, the company's general counsel, to check an obscure emergency clause buried deep within the Sterling family trust. Grace pulled the document and found it within minutes, a clause almost no one at the company remembered existed. If Joseph's authentication device was destroyed while actively connected to the network, the board's voting authority would be automatically suspended for 6 full hours. Ryan's fury was immediate and barely concealed, because the vote meant to remove Amelia from her position could no longer happen on schedule. Mason revealed that Joseph had grown suspicious weeks earlier of altered medical reports and quietly manipulated financial records circulating within the company. 3 weeks before that morning, Joseph had reached him through an old secure line, one Mason himself had designed years before during his time as chief architect of the Sentinel system. Joseph believed someone was using Sentinel itself to conceal the transfer of valuable intellectual property outside the company's control. He had asked Mason to deliver an offline data key directly into Amelia's hands, trusting no one else with the task. The envelope Mason carried held only half of that key. The other half had been stored inside the encrypted chip now sitting in his palm, the same chip pulled from the wreckage of his shattered phone. Jackson realized, with a growing weight in his chest, that his own actions might have destroyed the only piece of evidence capable of proving any of this. Connor suggested moving Mason down to a basement interrogation room, framing it as standard procedure for an unverified threat. While the group argued, Mason quietly studied the position of 3 lobby cameras and noticed their footage was running 14 seconds behind real time, a small but deliberate delay. It told him Connor already controlled the building's surveillance and was likely preparing to rewrite the record of everything happening in that lobby. Mason warned Amelia not to follow any security route that Connor had personally assigned, though she still was not fully convinced, uncertain whether to trust a man she had met less than an hour ago. What she could not deny was how much specific, unprompted detail Mason kept producing, details no outsider could have guessed at random. Ryan quietly messaged Connor to remove Mason from the area before Joseph could re-establish contact and complicate everything further. Jackson was ordered to place Mason in restraints. Before doing so, he found himself asking why Mason had not fought back when the phone was ripped from his hand in the first place. Mason answered simply that Jackson was a man being used, not the true enemy in this story, and something in that answer made Jackson hesitate for the first time all morning. Connor arrived personally with an armed security detail, claiming full command authority and demanding the envelope and chip be surrendered immediately. Mason placed the envelope directly into Amelia's hands instead of Connor's, a small act that changed Connor's expression instantly. He ordered both Mason and Jackson arrested for protocol violations, and in that moment Jackson finally understood that Connor was maneuvering to remove the one man who had simply been following every order given to him. It was a strange, cold realization, the kind that arrives too late to undo what has already been done, and Jackson found himself standing between two men he no longer knew how to trust. Mason watched the shift happen across Jackson's face and said nothing, giving him the space to reach that conclusion on his own rather than forcing it. Amelia, still holding the envelope Mason had placed in her hands, felt the weight of a decision she had not asked for settle over her, aware that whatever she chose next would determine far more than the outcome of one tense morning in a frozen lobby. Connor ordered the security team to move Mason down to the internal detention area without delay. Jackson noticed that two of the men in that detail were not part of the regular staff at all, wearing badges that looked convincing at a glance but did not match the department's actual roster. He asked them to produce verification codes. Connor stripped Jackson of his command authority on the spot, unwilling to let the question linger. One of the two imposters quietly drew a stun weapon and aimed it toward Mason. Jackson's training took over before conscious thought could catch up, and he knocked the weapon aside in one motion. A brief, chaotic struggle broke out across the lobby floor. Mason used only the minimum force necessary to disable one attacker without causing lasting injury, moving with a precision that surprised everyone watching, including Jackson himself. Amelia, Grace, Mason, and Jackson ran together into the technical corridor behind the main lobby. Ryan pretended to be separated from the group in the confusion, though in truth he stayed behind deliberately to keep coordinating with Connor from a safer distance. The building's automated systems sealed every corridor in sequence, turning Sterling Dominion into a maze controlled entirely from a central security hub Connor now commanded. As they moved, Mason explained that the destroyed phone had never been just a communication device. It had also served as a biometric authentication key. Fortunately, he had built the encrypted chip with the ability to preserve a final audio recording inside an impact-resistant memory core. If they could reach a specialized decoding station inside the Sentinel laboratory, they might recover Joseph's voice and the access codes embedded within it. That laboratory sat on floor 42, and the elevators remained locked throughout the building, forcing them to consider every stairwell and service corridor they could find. Jackson apologized to Mason for what he had done in the lobby, the words coming out rougher than he intended, stripped of the polish he usually kept around strangers. Mason did not offer forgiveness right away, but he acknowledged that Jackson was clearly trying to correct his mistake rather than hide from it. Amelia asked Mason why her father trusted him more than the very leadership team surrounding her every day. Mason explained briefly that he had once discovered a dangerous vulnerability inside the company's systems, one Ryan had pressured him to bury rather than disclose. Joseph had sided with Mason in that dispute, and Mason had chosen to walk away afterward rather than fight a battle over power and position that he never wanted in the first place. As the group climbed through a maintenance stairwell, Connor's voice went out over the building intercom, announcing falsely that Mason had taken Amelia hostage. Genuine security personnel, unaware of the truth, began actively hunting the group through the stairwells and corridors. Jackson was forced to use outdated access codes from his earlier years with the company to guide everyone through the maintenance levels undetected. On floor 18, they found an unconscious technician whose access badge had been stolen. Mason concluded that Connor was staging a fabricated breach designed to pin the entire crisis on him. The group pressed forward in tense silence, aware that every floor they climbed brought them closer to answers and closer to danger in equal measure. Grace kept close to Amelia, watching her carefully, aware that the young executive had never faced anything remotely like this in the sheltered years since taking over the company. Jackson, walking point ahead of the others, found himself replaying the moment in the lobby again and again, wondering how many other decisions he had made on faith rather than fact. Then the building's speaker system suddenly broadcast a synthesized voice imitating Amelia herself, ordering security to shoot Mason on sight if he resisted capture, and every one of them froze at the sound of a voice that was not quite right, close enough to fool a stranger but wrong enough to chill everyone who actually knew her. The group reached a secondary server room tucked behind a maintenance corridor few employees ever used. Mason connected the encrypted chip to a temporary decoding unit, though only a short fragment of audio survived the impact of the shattered phone. In that recovered clip, Joseph's voice confirmed that Ryan intended not only to remove Amelia from power but to sell access to the Sentinel system itself. Sentinel protected data belonging to banks, hospitals, airlines, and a number of federal agencies across the country. If the core encryption key changed hands, millions of records and several essential systems could be exposed to catastrophic breach. Grace discovered a pending transaction worth $480 million, scheduled for final approval before the end of the day. The receiving company was a shell entity, registered under an investment fund quietly linked to Ryan through several layers of paperwork. Amelia absorbed the revelation with visible pain, realizing the advisor she had trusted for years had been manipulating her the entire time, guiding her decisions while working against her interests behind every closed door. Mason explained that the complete body of evidence sat inside a server known only as the White Room, an offline data vault he and Joseph had designed together long before Mason ever left the company. Only 3 people had ever held access to it: Joseph himself, Mason, and whoever became Joseph's rightful successor. Amelia was that successor, though she had never actually been given the biometric key, because Joseph suspected for some time that she was being watched by someone close to her. Ryan needed Amelia's signature during the board session to formally legitimize the transfer of control, and the destruction of the phone had accidentally delayed that plan while also revealing to Ryan that Joseph was still very much alive. Mason's pager buzzed with a fragmented emergency signal, just 3 characters long, an alarm code indicating that Joseph was under attack at his hidden location. Mason understood immediately that Ryan had managed to trace Joseph through the very communication line that had just been compromised. He now faced an impossible choice, whether to leave the building to protect Joseph or remain behind to stop the transaction before it finalized. Amelia wanted to send outside help to the hidden location immediately, but she had no idea where it was. Mason revealed that the coordinates existed in 2 separate parts. He knew one half, while the other remained locked inside the audio data, still waiting to be fully recovered. The weight of that thought settled over the room slowly, a silence thicker than the darkness around them, as everyone began to understand that the crisis had grown far beyond a single company's boardroom politics. Jackson realized with a sinking feeling that his own reckless decision to smash the phone might have placed Joseph in direct and immediate danger. He offered to personally lead a rescue team the moment they located the full coordinates, determined to make up for what his impulsiveness had cost them. Mason did not blame him further, but he asked Jackson from that point forward to act only on verified evidence rather than instinct or command. Before anyone could plan further, Connor located the secondary server room and cut its power supply remotely. Darkness swallowed the room, the cooling systems fell silent, and the temperature began climbing rapidly around them. Mason quickly realized Connor intended to overheat the servers deliberately, burning away the only remaining evidence before anyone could stop him. Amelia's phone buzzed with an urgent online voting notice, warning that if she did not participate within 90 minutes, the board would automatically declare her unfit to continue leading the company she had inherited. She stared at the countdown on the screen, aware that every path forward now seemed to demand something she was not sure she was ready to give, whether that meant trusting a stranger completely or confronting the people who had raised her into this role in the first place. Grace tried to calculate whether the trust clause and the voting deadline could somehow be made to work in their favor, flipping through pages of legal language by the dim glow of emergency lighting, while the room around them grew warmer by the minute. Mason manually restarted the backup power supply moments before the servers overheated beyond recovery. He used an old maintenance line to transmit a fragment of the fraudulent transaction evidence out to a financial oversight authority, though the signal was intercepted midway, allowing only a partial dataset to escape. Grace found a clause permitting Amelia to request an emergency audit if 2 board members formally confirmed the request together. One of those members could be Grace herself, acting in her role as general counsel, but the second had to be found before Ryan managed to isolate every remaining ally. Amelia thought immediately of Elizabeth, a longtime board member currently on floor 35. Jackson offered to guide Amelia and Grace there personally, while Mason chose to remain behind, focused on recovering the remaining coordinates that would lead them to Joseph. Jackson hesitated at the idea of leaving Mason alone, aware that Connor was actively hunting him through every corridor of the building, and some old instinct told him that abandoning a post, even for good reason, was the kind of decision men usually regretted. Mason reminded him gently that protecting Amelia was still the correct priority. The only thing that had ever been wrong was who had been giving him the orders. Jackson accepted this and led Amelia and Grace out through a service duct toward the stairwell. Almost immediately, Mason found himself surrounded by Connor and two hired men. Connor admitted openly that he had falsified Mason's file and exploited Jackson's disciplined nature to his own advantage, remarking coldly that men like Jackson were always easy to manipulate because they were too afraid to trust their own judgment. Mason stalled for time by letting Connor believe the encrypted chip had already been damaged beyond any possible recovery. Meanwhile, Jackson discovered a security trap set on floor 30. Rather than rushing forward out of habit, he paused to manually verify the camera data first, proving to himself as much as anyone that he had genuinely learned from his earlier mistake. That caution allowed him to guide Amelia safely around an ambush, waiting just beyond the next doorway. They found Elizabeth locked inside her own office, her phone and computer both confiscated. She agreed to sign the audit request, but explained she would need Joseph's own access authority to fully neutralize whatever protections Ryan had built around himself. Back in the server room, Mason came under direct attack. He triggered the fire suppression system, filling the space with dense mist that gave him just enough cover to disable both of his attackers cleanly. Connor fled the scene clutching the encrypted chip he believed to be authentic. Mason had swapped it earlier, keeping the true chip hidden inside the back panel of his own watch, a habit built from years of never trusting a single point of failure. With the pressure momentarily lifted, he finished recovering the second half of Joseph's coordinates. The location turned out to be a private medical facility on the outskirts of Chicago. Mason relayed the coordinates to Jackson immediately. Jackson now faced a genuine choice, whether to remain inside the tower protecting Amelia or race across the city to rescue the man who had started this entire chain of events. Amelia made the decision for him, insisting that he go, declaring for the first time that she was ready to take full responsibility for whatever came next inside these walls. Jackson left the tower at a dead run, taking the stairs two at a time and pushing past a knot of confused employees still trying to understand why the building had locked itself down. While behind him, Connor picked up a phone of his own and gave the strike team at the medical facility a single chilling instruction, that Joseph Sterling was not to leave that building alive. Grace watched Jackson disappear down the stairwell and turned to Amelia with quiet concern, asking if she was certain about sending away the one person whose entire job was to keep her safe. Amelia only nodded, her eyes fixed on the sealed doors ahead of them, already thinking several steps past the danger in front of her toward the fight still waiting inside the boardroom. Jackson drove toward the medical facility while staying in contact with Mason through an encrypted radio link, weaving through wet Chicago streets under a sky still heavy with rain. He noticed two unmarked vehicles trailing him at a careful distance. Rather than confronting them directly, he relied on old tactical training to shake them loose without drawing further attention. When he arrived, he found that Joseph's private security detail had already been neutralized. Jackson moved inside and clashed with a group of hired attackers, fighting with fierce determination while still prioritizing the safety of patients and staff around him rather than acting recklessly. He located Joseph inside a reinforced safe room, still conscious, weakened but sharp-minded despite everything he had endured. When Joseph saw Jackson, he recognized him instantly as the man who had destroyed the phone earlier that day. Jackson admitted his mistake without excuses or deflection, telling Joseph plainly that he had trusted a false report instead of the man standing right in front of him. Joseph did not scold him. He simply asked whether Jackson now understood what a true protector was actually meant to defend, his voice weak but steady, the question carrying more weight than any reprimand could have managed. Jackson answered that he had to protect the truth before he protected any order given to him. Joseph confirmed quietly that he had indeed been the voice on the other end of that call, the one Mason had tried so hard to keep secure. He explained that he had been attempting to warn Mason that Ryan intended to trigger an illegal transfer of the company's most sensitive technology. The destroyed phone had accidentally activated a freeze protocol, buying them precious extra time, though it had also exposed the location of the communication line and led their enemies straight to the medical facility. Jackson took responsibility for getting Joseph back to the tower safely, a promise he made quietly, without the bravado he might have used a day earlier, as though the events of the morning had scraped away something performative in him and left only the plain determination underneath. Joseph revealed that he still carried a final biometric key hidden inside a secure medical bracelet on his wrist. If he appeared in person at the board session, Ryan would lose every shred of control he had built. Hired attackers had already sealed off the exits surrounding the facility. Jackson and the remaining security staff devised a plan to move Joseph out through a medical transport corridor typically reserved for emergencies. During the escape, Jackson took a wound to his shoulder but never stopped shielding Joseph from further harm, gritting through the pain without a single complaint. Joseph watched that sacrifice unfold and understood, perhaps for the first time, that Jackson was not a traitor at all, only a loyal man who had simply been pointed in the wrong direction by people he trusted too easily. They reached an armored vehicle waiting nearby. Joseph used a satellite connection to call Mason directly. For the first time in many months, Amelia heard her father's voice in real time, a brief but deeply emotional reunion carried entirely through sound. Joseph warned that Ryan had prepared one final piece of fabricated evidence intended to accuse Amelia of selling company data for personal gain. Back inside the tower, Ryan seized the moment to present that very evidence publicly to the assembled board, demanding Amelia's immediate arrest for what he called corporate treason, his voice ringing with false confidence through the packed conference room. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks, certain that with Joseph absent and Mason discredited, no one left in that room would have the standing or the courage to challenge him. What he did not yet know was that the armored vehicle carrying Joseph and Jackson was already crossing back into the city, moving faster than his carefully built timeline had accounted for, and that the ground beneath his entire plan was about to shift without warning. Ryan called the board together through the company's emergency meeting system, presenting documents that appeared to show Amelia secretly approving the sale of the Sentinel system, his tone measured and grave, playing the part of a reluctant colleague forced into an unpleasant duty rather than a man executing a plan he had spent months preparing. Amelia faced immense pressure to resign before the entire corporation collapsed under public scrutiny. Grace demanded a check of the digital signatures involved, but Ryan insisted the system had already verified everything as legitimate. Mason walked into the room carrying the recovered data pulled from the encrypted chip. Ryan mocked him openly, reminding everyone that he was a disgruntled former employee who had already been detained by security earlier that same day. Mason did not deny his past. Instead, he calmly explained the hidden architecture behind Sentinel's authentication system, speaking with the unhurried clarity of a man who had built the thing himself and had nothing left to prove to a room full of people who doubted him. Every high-level signature within the system generated something he called a time shadow, an invisible verification mark undetectable through any conventional interface. Ryan's fraudulent documents were missing that shadow entirely because Amelia's signature had simply been copied from an older, unrelated file. Ryan pushed back, pointing out that Mason had left the company 3 years earlier and technically held no remaining access. Mason revealed that he still retained technical authorship rights over the authentication core itself, a detail Ryan had once tried and failed to block during Mason's departure. Joseph had deliberately kept Mason's name inside the system's fallback protocol the entire time, anticipating exactly this kind of crisis. Connor entered the room holding what he believed to be the real encrypted chip, loudly accusing Mason of falsifying evidence against the company. Mason simply asked Connor to insert the chip into the decoding unit himself. The chip activated a hidden log that revealed Connor's unauthorized access to cameras, personnel files, and voice synthesis systems across the building, exactly the evidence Mason had allowed him to steal in the first place. Connor panicked and tried to bolt from the room, only to find the doorway blocked by security personnel now loyal to Jackson rather than Connor's chain of command. Ryan still held one advantage, since Joseph had not yet appeared in person and the family trust's voting authority remained unconfirmed. The countdown clock on the wall showed only 8 minutes remaining. Ryan pressed hard for an immediate vote, sensing his window closing fast. Several board members hesitated, fearful of what an ongoing scandal might do to the company's stock price and public reputation. Amelia had every opportunity to defend herself aggressively, yet she chose instead to speak plainly about her own mistakes, admitting she had trusted Ryan too completely, drifted from the employees she was meant to lead, and ignored internal warnings that should have alarmed her far sooner. That honesty visibly shifted the mood in the room, and Elizabeth, along with several other members, began reconsidering their positions in real time, exchanging glances that suggested doubt was finally settling where certainty had stood only minutes before. Ryan seized on her admission, declaring that her own confession only proved she lacked the competence to remain in charge. Just as the formal vote began, the conference room doors swung open. Jackson walked in with his arm bandaged and bloodied, and behind him walked Joseph Sterling himself, alive and unmistakably present. The entire room fell into stunned silence at the sight of him, chairs creaking as board members turned in disbelief, several rising halfway out of their seats before catching themselves. Joseph looked directly at Ryan and declared, in a voice that filled the whole room despite its weakness, that the person truly on trial today was not his daughter, and that everyone present was about to learn exactly how far one man's greed had reached inside a company built on trust. Joseph authenticated his voting authority through the secure bracelet on his wrist, immediately suspending the vote and freezing every operational power Ryan had assumed for himself. Grace presented the financial transactions, camera logs, and falsified records she had gathered throughout the day, laying them out methodically before the stunned board. Joseph revealed he had grown suspicious of Ryan nearly 6 months earlier, long before any of this crisis reached the surface. The failed attempt to poison him had made it painfully clear that this was no longer an ordinary business dispute but something far more dangerous. He admitted he had deliberately allowed the public to believe he was incapacitated, hoping the deception would eventually force the people plotting against him into the open. Mason had been chosen specifically because he was the one person who fully understood Sentinel yet held no financial stake whatsoever in the company's outcome. Ryan fired back, accusing Joseph of manipulating everyone in the room and insisting the company needed a stronger hand at the helm than Amelia could ever provide. In a last desperate move, he triggered a remote deletion command intended to wipe out the incriminating data entirely. Mason had anticipated exactly this possibility and had already switched the system into an offline mirroring mode. Every deletion command Ryan issued only created fresh evidence, each one automatically stamped and linked directly back to his own account. Connor, cornered and desperate, snatched a weapon from a nearby security officer and grabbed Amelia, using her as a shield against the room. Jackson wanted to charge forward immediately, but Mason signaled him to wait, reading the situation with a calm that kept everyone from making a fatal mistake. Mason told Connor plainly that Ryan had already prepared a file designed to place the entire blame squarely on his shoulders alone. Grace opened a document proving Ryan had authorized payments to Connor disguised as independent contractor fees, evidence that made it obvious Connor had only ever been a tool in someone else's larger plan. Connor's grip loosened as the realization hit him, and in that brief lapse of focus, Jackson subdued him cleanly without putting Amelia in any further danger. Ryan made a final attempt to escape through a private executive elevator reserved for senior leadership. The Sentinel system denied his access outright, since Joseph had already revoked his credentials the moment he confirmed his own identity. Ryan found himself trapped inside the very building he had once hoped to control entirely for himself. Federal investigators and financial regulators arrived shortly afterward, alerted by the fragment of data Mason had managed to transmit earlier that day, their arrival bringing a strange sense of order to a building that had spent the entire morning locked in chaos. Both Ryan and Connor were taken into custody, facing charges connected to fraud, assault, data manipulation, and reckless endangerment of human life, the full weight of months of scheming finally catching up to both of them in the span of a single afternoon. Jackson voluntarily surrendered his weapon and employee credentials, accepting full responsibility for the force he had used and the equipment he had destroyed earlier that morning. Mason confirmed publicly that Jackson had indeed made serious mistakes, but he was also the same man who ultimately helped save both Joseph and Amelia when it mattered most. Joseph refused to interfere with the ongoing investigation in any way, a quiet but powerful demonstration that no one within Sterling Dominion, regardless of name or title, stood above the law. As the chaos of the day finally began to settle, Amelia turned to Mason and asked, with unexpected softness in her voice, whether he intended to disappear again now that everything was finally resolved, the question carrying more weight than either of them fully acknowledged in the moment, hanging in the quiet aftermath of a day that had upended everything they both thought they understood about the people around them. Several weeks later, Sterling Dominion released the findings of an independent audit to the public. The proposed sale of the Sentinel system was formally canceled. Every board member connected to Ryan's scheme was quietly replaced with new leadership committed to transparency. Amelia remained chief executive, but she voluntarily placed her own decisions under an independent oversight process for a full year, determined to rebuild trust from the ground up rather than simply moving past the crisis. She reopened internal feedback lines that Ryan had shut down long before, giving employees a genuine voice inside the company again. Grace was promoted to lead a newly formed ethics and compliance division, a role she approached with the same careful precision she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Joseph stepped back from daily operations but continued advising Amelia from a quieter distance, content to watch his daughter grow into the leader he always believed she could become. Proud in a way he rarely put into words, but that showed clearly enough in the way he looked at her across every meeting they now shared. Mason was offered the position of Global Director of Technology Security, a title with significant power and visibility. He declined the more expansive privileges that typically came with it, accepting only on the condition that the systems under his care would serve public safety rather than become tools of surveillance over ordinary people. He also insisted on establishing a formal protection process for employees who came forward to report wrongdoing, unwilling to let another situation like this one go unnoticed for so long. Amelia agreed without hesitation or negotiation. The circumstances of Mason's life as a single father were mentioned only briefly when he asked that his schedule leave room for the parts of his life that had nothing to do with corporate towers or encrypted systems. No child ever appeared directly within the unfolding events. The internal investigation concluded that Jackson had not participated in the underlying conspiracy at all. He was suspended for a period of time due to his destruction of company property and his excessive use of force earlier that day. After completing a full accountability review, Jackson was invited back in a new capacity, serving as Director of Security Training and Command Ethics, a role built specifically around the lessons he had learned the hardest way possible. Jackson met Mason in the very same lobby where the phone had been destroyed months earlier. He handed Mason a new secured device, purchased entirely with his own personal funds as a quiet gesture of amends. Mason did not accept it immediately. He asked Jackson what he had truly taken away from everything that happened. Jackson answered that real strength was never about reacting the fastest, but about pausing long enough to recognize who was actually telling the truth. Mason accepted the phone, a simple gesture that closed the distance between them at last. Amelia walked past at that moment and joked that this time Jackson should probably let Mason finish his call. Joseph happened to call at exactly that instant. Jackson glanced at the screen, stepped back, and held the door open for Mason instead of reaching for the device. Mason stepped into the elevator alongside Amelia, while Jackson remained behind in the lobby, a quiet, relieved smile settling across his face. The phone that had once been destroyed was long gone, but the truth, the loyalty, and the chance to make things right had all remained fully intact. Jackson was never truly a villain in this story. His greatest mistake was confusing loyalty with blind obedience, mistaking a chain of command for the truth itself. Mason won not because he held wealth, rank, or extraordinary strength over anyone else in that lobby. He won because he refused to let public humiliation strip away his composure or his judgment. Amelia saved her company by admitting her own failures instead of protecting a polished image built to hide them. Joseph came to understand that an empire cannot survive on encryption and mystery alone. It needs people willing to speak the truth even when silence would be far easier. The shattered phone became a lasting symbol of judgment made too quickly, a warning about the danger of deciding who someone is before hearing their whole story. Jackson had seen only a man in an old coat, unscheduled and seemingly powerless, standing alone in a lobby with nothing but a sealed envelope. He never imagined the voice on the other end of that call could decide the fate of an entire corporation. Yet the deeper twist in this story was never really about Joseph's hidden identity. It was that Mason recognized the possibility of redemption inside the very man who had just humiliated him, and chose to extend it anyway. Consider for a moment the people you may have judged too quickly before ever learning their full story, and what might change if you paused instead of reacting. There will always be more stories like this one, about dignity, justice, and the quiet power of second chances.